Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the biggest stories of the 20th century, the end of the British Empire in Africa. And we're going to look at it through the eyes of the individuals, the key players, whose vision and sheer will brought a colonial superpower to its knees. After World War II, this wasn't just some academic debate. For a whole new generation of African leaders, this was the question. The old colonial powers were weakened, a new world order was taking shape, and it was all up for grabs. Who was going to decide Africa's future?
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll set the stage with the post-war power shift that really opened the door for change. Then, we'll meet the architects of independence, look at the tough liberation struggles, grapple with the messy realities of power, and finally, try to figure out the lasting imprint of these incredible people.
Okay, let's jump right in. The world after 1945 was, it was a totally different planet. All the old certainties were just falling apart. And for the British Empire, the very ground beneath its feet was starting to shake. It was kind of a perfect storm, really. You had this growing, educated class of Africans who were more aware than ever of the world beyond their borders. And that awareness created this deep, powerful dissatisfaction with being ruled by someone else. This wasn't just background noise. This was the fertile soil from which a whole new crop of nationalist leaders would grow, ready to take on the British head-on. So let's meet some of these pioneers, the ones who literally wrote the playbook for independence. We're going to start in West Africa, where at least at first, the fight was mostly a political one. And you have to start with this guy, Kwame Nkrumah. He was educated in America, soaked up all these radical Pan-African ideas, and then came back to the Gold Coast with this incredibly powerful, simple demand: self-government now. This was a massive shock to the system. The older generation of leaders wanted to take it slow, but Nkrumah, he wasn't waiting for anyone. And his strategy was just brilliant, a total masterclass in politics. He didn't try to work within the old system. He built his own. He created this massive grassroots movement, the Convention People's Party. He even used his own arrest to become a political martyr. And then, and this is the amazing part, he wins a landslide election from his prison cell. That kind of pressure was impossible to ignore, and it forced Britain's hand, leading to Ghana's independence in 1957. But for Nkrumah, Ghana was just the beginning. His vision was way bigger. He was a true believer in Pan-Africanism, this idea that all African people were connected and should unite. It was this dream that pushed him to help create things like the Organization of African Unity. He pictured this strong, united Africa that could really hold its own on the world stage.
Now, while Nkrumah was out there mobilizing huge crowds, a totally different strategy was unfolding right next door in Nigeria. And at the center of it was another giant of the movement, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, or as everyone called him, Zik. And his weapon of choice? Not the protest, but the printing press.
Zik's game was all about building influence and, carefully navigating some very tricky waters. He built up this whole media empire to get nationalist ideas out there. But his biggest challenge wasn't the British, it was Nigeria itself. It's this huge, incredibly diverse country. He knew that if it was going to hold together, he had to balance all these different ethnic groups. That's why he pushed so hard for a federal system, to give everyone a piece of the pie. But that political playbook from West Africa, it just didn't work everywhere. Because in colonies where you had large numbers of white settlers who had dug in and called the place home, the road to freedom was never going to be peaceful negotiation. It was going to be a violent, bloody struggle. Take Kenya. In Kenya, it was all about one thing: land. And Jomo Kenyatta became the voice for his people, the Kikuyu, in this desperate fight. They were fighting a system that had just taken their best farmland and given it to white settlers. So for Kenyatta, nationalism wasn't some abstract political theory, it was a fight for survival. And Kenyatta's own story just shows you how intense this all was. The British threw him in prison for almost 10 years, claiming he was the mastermind behind the violent Mau Mau uprising. But you know what? All that did was turn him into a legend. When he finally got out, there was no question who was in charge. He made this incredible leap from political prisoner to Kenya's first president. And of course, you can't talk about this era without turning to South Africa. This is where one man became the global symbol for the fight for freedom: Nelson Mandela. And his enemy was apartheid, this uniquely evil system of racial oppression that was brutally enforced by the government.
This timeline here is so important because it shows you how his strategy changed over time. Mandela started out committed to nonviolence, leading things like the Defiance Campaign. But after the government responded with pure brutality, like the Sharpsville massacre, he came to a really difficult conclusion that peaceful protest just wasn't going to cut it. That's when he co founded the armed wing of the ANC, a choice that kicked off a whole new chapter in the struggle and would eventually cost him 27 years of his life in prison.
And these words just, wow. Imagine it. He's on trial in 1964. He could get the death penalty. But instead of begging for his life, he stands up and gives this incredible speech that just electrified the world. He defended the ideal of a free and equal society, and in doing so, he became this massive moral authority, even locked away in a cell.
Okay, so winning independence is one thing, but actually governing, building a new nation from scratch, that, it turns out, was a whole different ballgame, and often a much, much harder one. And here's the tough truth. The skills that make you a great revolutionary don't necessarily make you a great democratic leader. That incredible unity you have when you're fighting a common enemy, it can fall apart really fast once you're actually in charge and have to make hard decisions. And what you see here is a heartbreaking pattern that repeated itself across the continent. Kwame Nkrumah, the hero who freed Ghana, ended up creating a one-party state and crushing dissent before he was overthrown in a coup. So what was going on? Well, for one, these new countries inherited the same old authoritarian tools the colonizers had used. Plus, they were under enormous pressure to develop fast, which often meant centralizing power. And so, the liberators, caught between internal conflicts and the pressures of the Cold War, often became the new strongmen. So after all that, what's the final verdict? When you look back at these powerful, complicated, sometimes contradictory lives, what was their ultimate imprint on history? There's no doubt that these leaders were the essential spark. They gave a voice to the people's anger and forced the empire to retreat. But it's a story of deep contrasts. The way they fought was totally shaped by their circumstances, whether they were in a settler colony or not. And their legacies are, well, they're messy. It's this complicated mix of genuine, incredible liberation on one hand, and way too often, a slide into authoritarian rule on the other. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. Sure, the big historical forces were there, creating the opportunity for change. But was any of this inevitable? The actual paths they took, the choice to negotiate or to fight, to unite or to divide, those came down to the choices made by these specific people. Their decisions, made in the fire of the moment, didn't just happen in history. They made history. And that imprint is still shaping the continent today.